Welcome to the deep dive. Right now, pretty much every camera in the country is pointed at the Supreme Court for this massive legal showdown.
Yeah, it is entirely taking over the news cycle today.
It really is. Today is Wednesday, April 1st, 2026, and the case is Trump v. Barbara. And if you turn on a TV, everyone is treating this clash over civil mandates and birthright citizenship as, a purely modern political crisis.
Right, just standard contemporary politics.
Exactly. But the stack of sources we're unpacking today claims you are basically completely blind to what is actually happening on those courthouse steps right now, unless you are willing to rewind history by over 500 years.
Which is quite the claim. The author of these documents provides what they call a forensic blueprint.
Okay.
It's this highly detailed, deeply provocative historical narrative. And it traces the gradual erosion of this original American covenant, starting all the way back with the invention of the printing press in the 1400s.
That ending literally today.
Literally today, yeah.
Yeah.
With the legal siege happening right now in Washington.
So before we go any further, I do want to just say, if you are reading these sources with us, you will immediately notice they present a very polarized, religiously charged narrative.
Very much so.
The text frames history as this centuries-long existential battle between Protestant individual carriers on one side and system loyalists on the other.
Right, and it specifically points fingers at Roman Catholic hierarchies historically and modern legal organizations like the ACLU today.
Yeah, and we just need to be super clear right up front. We are not endorsing these viewpoints. We aren't taking any political sides here.
Definitely not.
Our mission is just to impartially map out this really fascinating historical argument exactly as the author presents it. We just want to help you understand the mechanics of this unique perspective.
And the core tension of that entire framework is really the story of a dramatic downgrade.
A downgrade.
Yeah, the author argues that America was originally engineered to be this highly defended wilderness sanctuary, right?
Yeah.
But through a series of very specific demographic and legal breaches, it got transformed into an unprotected common field.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because the narrative doesn't just start with the Declaration of Independence, right?
No, not at all.
To understand the psychology of the people who built that original sanctuary, the sources insist we have to look at the technology that created their worldview.
Right, the technological code break. The starting line drawn here is 1474.
Which is when William Caxton's printing press delivered the first English books.
Exactly. And to understand the magnitude of this, the author describes the era before 1474 as a time when the Roman imperial system had effectively absorbed Christianity.
So they just took it over.
Yeah, the claim is they cloaked these old, centralized, pagan power structures in Christian titles to create this top-down hierarchy.
A system that was built entirely on hoarding information.
Yes, the mechanism of control was language itself. By locking the scriptures in Latin, a language the common person couldn't even read.
They couldn't read it, so they couldn't verify anything.
Right. The system ensured the population stayed completely dependent. Dogmas were generated from the top down and enforced through ideas like the divine right of kings.
So the Word of God was basically a captive of the Vatican.
Essentially, yes. And the printing press functioned as this mechanical sledgehammer that finally shattered that millennium-long monopoly.
I like to think of it less like the dawn of the internet and more like a massive, decentralized, cryptographic key leak.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Because, the Roman system held the master key, right? Latin. They were the sole mediators of truth, and suddenly the press decentralizes that authority.
The written word goes straight to the people in their native language.
Exactly. And according to the text, that creates a brand new sociological profile, the individual carrier.
The individual carrier is basically the engine of the Reformation. Once the word was accessible, these individuals realized the top-down system was, well, the text calls it a forensic fraud.
Wow, forensic fraud.
Yeah. They realized they no longer needed a pope or a king acting as a toll booth between them and their creator. And this realization triggered a mass exodus.
They sought a physical location where the word was the ultimate authority.
Right, which led them across the Atlantic to establish that wilderness sanctuary we talked about.
And the sources really emphasize that this wasn't some gentle utopian refuge. The American wilderness operated as a doggone tough filter.
Very tough.
Yeah.
It was an environment so physically brutal that it naturally repelled what the author calls fat cat institutions.
Fat cat institutions, yeah. It only attracted radical individuals completely committed to a direct personal covenant.
And the demographic data the author uses to anchor this point is actually pretty striking.
Yeah, let's talk about the 1776 census marker.
So they rely on this to show that at the founding of the United States, the Roman system had virtually zero foothold here.
Almost none.
Across the entire 13 colonies, only 1% of the population was Catholic. That's roughly 25,000 people total.
And the numbers get even more granular than that. The documents state there were only 6 priests and 0 bishops in the entire country at that time.
Right. The colonies were just an overwhelming Protestant stronghold. You had Pilgrims, Puritans, Quakers.
Populations that were intimately familiar with the European systems they had just fled.
Exactly. Consequently, they built these forensic walls into their early laws to protect the sanctuary they had literally suffered to build.
So I want to pause on the concept of these walls for a second because the author uses this phrase, Hebraic Republic.
Yes, the Hebraic Republic.
We are talking about early Protestants here, so where does that Hebraic term fit into their legal framework?
Well, a Hebraic Republic refers to a society governed by the rule of law based on a biblical covenant, rather than just the arbitrary decrees of a human king.
Okay, that makes sense.
The early colonists really viewed themselves as entering into a binding legal contract with God, modeled directly on the ancient Israelites. And to protect that contract, the walls were severe.
Extremely severe. I mean, the documents mention that early states like Virginia would actually arrest priests simply for crossing the border into their territory?
Right, which modern readers obviously view as pure religious bigotry.
Yeah, of course. But the author frames it strictly as a matter of national security.
Exactly. They didn't view these priests as just, neighbors with a different theology. They viewed them as foreign agents.
Agents representing a sovereign political head of state.
The Pope, yeah. Agents trying to subvert their independent republic. That strict defensive posture is what the author considers the absolute peak of the American covenant.
But those walls couldn't hold forever.
No, they didn't.
And what's fascinating is the sources point out that the breach didn't actually come from an invading army. It came from the colonists' own financial success.
Yes. The prosperity trap.
The prosperity trap. It's such an interesting mechanism. 2 or 3 generations after the founding, the nation basically just grew comfortable.
The brutal heavy lifting of clearing the wilderness was over.
Right, and winning the revolution was largely in the past, so that original survival-level faith sort of cooled down. The author uses a very specific phrase here. Vigilance transitioned into tolerance.
And that transition from vigilance to tolerance is identified as the fatal vulnerability.
How so?
Well, it opened the door to a fundamental clash over how citizenship and faith are actually defined.
Okay, so what does this all actually mean? Because I'm looking at this incredibly detailed chart in the sources right now called the Mandatory Protocol.
Right, the 5-step protocol.
Yeah, it reads almost like a theological syllabus. It outlines the original Protestant covenant as this rigorous legal contract.
Step 1 is maturation and conscious repentance.
Right. Step 2 is water baptism. Step 3 is receiving the Holy Ghost. Step 4 is picking up the cross through active obedience.
Exactly.
But I'm honestly struggling to see how a theological checklist translates into a breakdown of constitutional law. Like, how do those connect?
The connection lies entirely in the concept of consent. Look really closely at step 1, maturation.
Yeah.
You cannot force this protocol on an infant. It absolutely demands cognitive awareness and a conscious adult choice to abandon an old life and enter into a new covenant.
So it requires active participation.
Yes. Which is exactly the opposite of the incoming demographic.
I see.
The system loyalists operated on top-down, inherited membership. I mean, just think of infant baptism, right?
Right, where the choice is made for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In that system, the institution claims jurisdiction over you before you even have the cognitive ability to think for yourself.
Wow.
So the author argues that in a republic based entirely on conscious consent, if you import millions of citizens trained from birth to accept top-down, non-consensual authority, the foundational psychology of the republic basically just collapses.
And the demographic shift they highlight to prove this is massive.
Huge.
The sources detail this absolute flood of immigration starting in the 1840s. By 1850, the Catholic population jumped from that original 25,000 up to 1.75 million.
And by 1860, it hit 4.5 million, abruptly becoming the nation's largest religious group.
But the author does not view this as standard historical migration at all.
No. They explicitly frame it as a Trojan horse. The theory is that the Roman system, having failed to stamp out the Reformation in Europe, basically weaponized migration.
To export its hierarchy directly into the New World.
Exactly.
The logical leap there is huge, though. I mean, the author is suggesting millions of Irish and German immigrants were a deliberate, coordinated weapon.
It's a bold claim, yeah.
How did the fiercely protective descendants of the original colonies just let that happen?
The documents attribute this to what they call the namesake error.
Namesake error.
Yeah, the descendants of the individual carriers had grown tolerant because of all that prosperity we talked about. When this massive influx arrived, the Americans looked at the label, saw the Christian namesake, and just assumed a shared value system.
So they completely forgot the centralized institutional power structures that these populations were historically bound to.
Right. By abandoning their vigilance, they essentially just opened the gates of the sanctuary.
And the author claims this allowed system loyalists to quietly infiltrate the legal, educational, and judicial structures of the nation.
Reestablishing the old world hierarchy from the inside out.
But demographics alone don't just magically change laws. The narrative requires a specific legal mechanism to actually dismantle the walls of the sanctuary, right?
Yes, and the author pinpoints a forensic hijack of the Constitution that occurred just after the Civil War.
Okay. This centers on the 14th Amendment, passed in 1868. Now, historically, the 14th Amendment was this massive civil rights triumph intended to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people.
Absolutely.
It was an internal, sovereign correction to a horrific injustice. So, to frame that as a hijack requires a pretty serious explanation. Walk me through the mechanics of that argument.
Well, the hijack, according to the sources, wasn't the amendment itself. It was a back door opened 30 years later.
Okay.
In 1898, the Supreme Court ruled on a case called United States v. Wong Kim Ark. And the entire erosion of the covenant basically hinges on how the court interpreted 4 specific words in the 14th Amendment.
Which 4 words?
Subject to the jurisdiction.
Subject to the jurisdiction. Okay, so the author argues the original Protestant individual carrier intent of that phrase meant total political allegiance, right?
Yes. You are fully, legally, and spiritually bound to the sovereignty of the nation, and you are severing all ties to foreign powers.
But the 1898 legal twist redefined those 4 words to mean mere physical presence. Birthright citizenship.
Exactly. If your feet are physically located on the dirt, you are automatically granted the full covenant of citizenship.
It really represents a total downgrade from a strict conscious covenant to just a geographic technicality.
Yes, it does.
Here's where it gets really interesting, actually. Let's test that logic with an analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a highly secure proprietary corporate network, right? Gaining access requires signing a multi-page legally binding contract swearing to protect the company's intellectual property.
Right, severing ties with competitors, passing a rigorous security clearance.
Exactly, that is total allegiance. But the 1898 ruling basically decided that merely stepping foot into the lobby of the corporate headquarters automatically grants you master root access to the entire server.
That's a great way to put it. By legally deciding that physical location equals total jurisdiction, the highly defended sanctuary was just downgraded into an unprotected common field.
And the author views this 150-year-old legal precedent as the actual crowbar that broke the nation.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it took the power of citizenship away from the conscious contractual choice of the individual and handed it over to an open-door policy.
And this legal mechanism is what supposedly allowed a globalist flood to wash over the original covenant throughout the 20th century.
Which brings us right up to the present. All of those dominoes, the 1840s population shift, the 1898 legal crowbar, they lead us directly to the standoff happening today.
April 1st, 2026. The steps of the Supreme Court. The case of Trump v. Barbara.
The modern siege. Today's case is presented as the ultimate collision of these 2 centuries-old forces.
So on one side, you have the ACLU, and the sources frame them as modern agents of the system loyalists, fighting to maintain the physical presence interpretation.
Right. They're defending the open-door policy that keeps the common field accessible to the globe.
And on the other side, you have the current administration's civil mandate. They're fighting for what the author calls a forensic correction.
A forensic correction, yeah. The mandate seeks to restore the requirement of total allegiance.
They are arguing in court today that simply slipping across a border does not magically sever your ties to old world systems.
Right, and therefore, mere physical presence gives you no legal claim to the covenant of citizenship.
And there is a genuinely unprecedented detail from today's proceedings that the sources highlight.
There is, for the first time in American history, a sitting president physically sat in the courtroom during oral arguments today.
Yeah, and the author does not view that as just some political photo op. They elevate it to a covenant marker.
The covenant marker, yes.
The president sitting in that room is described as representing the mandate of the millions. He is standing in as the representative of the modern remnant of those original individual carriers.
The citizens who are finally trying to reclaim the land and rebuild the walls of the sanctuary from the inside.
The stakes outlined for the expected June 2026 ruling are described in pretty apocalyptic terms, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. The sources frame this as the final forensic determination of the American promise.
Yeah, the author drops some massive prophetic jargon here. They claim that if the court rules in favor of the ACLU and upholds birthright citizenship, it will trigger the abomination of desolation for the legal system.
Which is a heavy phrase.
It is. They say it means the lamb is speaking as a dragon. Can you just unpack the mechanics of that imagery for me?
Sure, the imagery is very specific. The lamb represents the Christian namesake, right? The exterior appearance of a gentle Protestant republic.
No.
The dragon represents the ancient imperial power of the Roman system. So if the Supreme Court upholds the open door, the author believes it proved the legal system is completely hollowed out.
It looks like the American lamb on the outside, but it speaks with the absolute top-down authority of the Roman dragon on the inside.
Exactly. It proves the system is fully compromised.
But on the flip side, if the court rules for the mandate, it achieves the forensic correction,
Right. It officially restores the sanctuary walls.
signaling that the descendants of the individual carriers have finally reclaimed the jurisdictional ground that was lost starting way back in the 1840s.
And this June ruling is supposedly only the beginning of the final phase.
Right.
The sources assert that this legal battle is the threshold to a prophetic window spanning from 2029 to 2036.
The text actually calls this window a divine rescue mission. We are supposedly entering a period where the wheat is finally separated from the tares.
The argument is that the overarching government structure may no longer be able to protect the sanctuary at all. The doggone tough years of the 1600s are returning.
So it will require individuals to physically, legally, and spiritually defend the covenant themselves.
Picking up their cross, just like the original mandatory protocol demanded, the era of tolerance is over and the era of vigilance is returning.
Wow. The chronological journey these sources map out is just staggering.
It covers so much ground.
We started with the sledgehammer of the 1474 printing press that broke a millennium of centralized control. We examined the strict, heavily defended 1% demographic of the 1776 wilderness sanctuary,
Right, and then we explored how the prosperity trap led to the 1840s population flood.
which ultimately set the stage for the 1898 legal twist of the 14th Amendment. That specific legal crowbar pried the door open, downgrading the sanctuary to a common field, leading all the way to today's 2026 civil mandate standoff at the Supreme Court.
And the reason this highly specific historical blueprint really matters to you, the listener, is because the narratives we use to understand the past profoundly shape how we view modern law. Whether you look at today's Supreme Court case as a standard, dry debate over constitutional phrasing, or as a centuries-in-the-making contractual collision, it reveals just how deeply rooted our modern arguments about citizenship, borders, and civil duty really are.
The past is literally the operating system running our current political debates.
It really is.
It forces an examination of the concept of tolerance, which the author identifies as the fatal flaw that breached the system. The sources argue that American prosperity caused vigilance to transition into tolerance, dissolving the walls of the sanctuary.
Which is a tough pill to swallow for a modern audience.
It is, but you have to wonder, in any society, or even in your own personal life, at what point does unconditional tolerance of a new operating system risk completely dismantling the root code that built your success in the first place? And ultimately, who gets to decide what that foundational code is? When you watch the news tonight and you see that jagged white line of the Supreme Court steps, remember the timeline. Depending on how you read the history, you might just be looking at the final walls of the wilderness sanctuary.